Welcome to Military Analytics. The war between Ukraine and Russia caused socio-cultural, economic, and psychological destruction in the Russian Federation and exposed the great cracks in the Russian army. The war certainly went badly for Moscow, starting from a plan to seize Kiev and overthrow the Ukrainian government in just 3 days. The Russian military is now installing air defense weapons systems all over Moscow to protect important buildings. Images from Russia show the Pantsir's 1 medium-range surface-to-air air defense weapon atop the Russian Ministry of Defense. It is not clear why the Kremlin decided to take this step. The reinforcement of Moscow's air defenses came as Russia continued to warn the West against supplying Ukraine with ammunition that could give it the ability to strike deep. But by showing the will and ability to strike deep into Russia, the Ukrainians planted seeds of fear in the heart of Russian leader Vladimir Putin. Although no official statement has been made by the Kremlin administration station, the main reason for the establishment of air defense systems is the fear of the potential of Ukraine to attack Russian cities. The importance of the newly detected Pantsir's 1 systems is diminished by the fact that Ukraine currently does not have long-range missiles that can do real damage. And at this point there is no clear indication that the US or other Western countries intend to provide them. However, we have witnessed many times that Vladimir Putin is not wrong in this fear, especially since December 2022. Ukraine focused on cross-border operations. In December, it was argued for days that Moscow was powerless to stop Ukraine's attacks at home, following accusations over the bombing of a military installation in the Bryansk region of southern Russia. In addition, Ukrainian drone attacks on Dyagilev and Engels, one of Russia's most important military airports in December, caused panic and fear in Moscow. The Kremlin blamed Ukraine for the attacks on 2 airports hundreds of miles from the Russian border last month. But Ukraine has not formally claimed responsibility for the attacks, which Russia claims were carried out by drones. Ukraine's last cross-border operation took place in the Bryansk region at night. The Ukrainian armed forces launched a missile attack on the territory of the Bryansk region. Short-range missiles launched by Kiev fell in the sky area. Russian checkpoints in this region were subjected to intense Ukrainian attacks. We learned that there were violent explosions that interrupted the sleep of Bryansk residents. Ukrainian missiles pierced the pitch black of the night and illuminated the Russian skies. We can say that the civilian population in the regions where the explosion took place experienced moments of fear. It is not known what weapons were used in the attack, but the borders of the Unexki district of the Bryansk region are located approximately 40 kilometers from the nearest part of the Ukrainian border, which does not allow the passage of the armed forces. According to the statement of the Bryansk regional president, it was learned that the missile attack organized by the Ukrainian armed forces was repelled by the air defense system. There was no damage or loss of life, and the operational services were working on site. On the one hand, the Ukrainian armed forces carry out cross-border operations against Russia. On the other hand, they struggled to push back the Moscow army on the front lines. Ukrainian Defense Forces planes launched 21 attacks on the areas concentrated by the Russian invaders and 6 attacks on the positions of anti-aircraft missile systems. In addition, the rocket destroyed the Ukrainian troops and artillery by hitting 6 command posts, 7 Russian troops, concentration zones, and an ammunition depot belonging to the invaders. The Ukrainian war has been going on for 48 weeks. Another day of combat means another day of heavy casualties for Russian forces on the ground. Russian soldiers are suffering and hundreds are killed or injured every day. Overall, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense claims that as of this week, Ukrainian forces have killed around 120,000 Russian soldiers. As the Current Affairs YouTube channel, all of our findings are created by the work and analysis of our field warfare expert team, and are based on data from the US, UK, Russia and Ukraine, Ministry of Defense, and independent war analysis and monitoring sources. These attacks, repelled by the Ukrainian Defense Forces, took place near a number of settlements in Donetsk and the neighboring Luhansk region. However, hot cracks continue to occur on the front lines. Russian forces do not stop fighting for success on the Ukrainian fronts. The south of Ukraine is starting to move again. Wagner Group, a Russian paramilitary unit, is announcing progress in the Donetsk region, while a local official from Russia's side recently announced that fighting has recently escalated in the Zaporizhzhia region in southern Ukraine, Russian forces allegedly captured a village about 50 kilometers from the Ukrainian-controlled city of Zaporizhia. It is also stated that Russian forces opened fire on a dozen regional villages in the city with tanks, mortars, and artillery. In Zaporizhia, its update on concentrated Russian military activity appears to be in line with the latest operational update of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. The Ukrainian General Staff wrote on Facebook the other day that the opponent, meaning Russia, carried out offensive actions in the direction of Zaporizhia, Bakhmut, and Avdiivka. The escalating conflict in Zaporizhia came as Russian and Wagner Group forces claimed to have made gains in eastern Donetsk, where Russia had waged a month-long and crushing struggle to capture the Ukrainian-controlled city of Bakhmut. The chief of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, an ally of Russian President Vladimir Putin, announced on Telegram that his forces had taken full control of the village of Alexeyevka, just south of Bakhmut. Taking Alexeyevka will only be a small breakthrough, but the Kremlin is hungry for good news from the battlefield. After months of setbacks, while the Ukrainian front lines continue to mobilize, the Western allies continue to receive answers that will please Kiev. Fearing that winter will give Russian forces time to regroup and launch a major offensive, Ukraine seeks more help to fight the invasion of Moscow. More countries have responded to President Vladimir Zelensky's call to send more weapons to Ukraine, concerned that Ukraine may only have a narrow window before the expected spring offensive begins. Western officials are working to speed up the delivery of heavy and sophisticated weapons to Kiev. The USA announced that a package worth $2.5 billion will be sent, including armored vehicles and air defense systems. In the statement made by the U.S. Department of Defense, the package includes 59 Bradley combat vehicles, 90 Stryker armored personnel carriers, 53 mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, and 350 high-mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicles. The U.S. Department of Defense said the latest date also includes additional ammunition for the high-moving artillery rocket systems, 8 Avenger air defense systems, tens of thousands of artillery shells, and about 2,000 anti-armor rockets. Also, several European countries have promised their own new packages, including hundreds of missiles committed by Britain to Kiev. The announcements come ahead of a tough meeting scheduled for Friday in Germany, where 50 countries will coordinate arms supplies. At a meeting on Thursday, representatives from 11 countries gathered at an army base in Estonia to discuss a series of new packages that will help Ukraine regain territory and fend off further Russian advances. A total of 9 countries pledged further support, including the United Kingdom, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Denmark, the Czech Republic, Estonia, the Netherlands, and Slovakia. At the same time, Denmark announced that it will hand over 19 French-made Caesar-type self-propelled howitzers to Ukraine, according to the Danish Ministry of Defense. Along with the transfer of equipment training of the Ukrainian army is also planned. But at the end of this aid, the real question remained: will Berlin finally agree to send advanced German-made battle tanks to Ukraine, or at least allow other countries that now have them to do so? Ukraine and some of its allies are pressing Germany to allow the supply or export of advanced Leopard 2 tanks. But there are conflicting reports on what Berlin might do. Chancellor Olaf Scholz made it clear that Germany, still emerging from its post-World War II hatred of a strong military, would not act alone. This means that in the case of Leopards, Berlin will not send anything from its own stocks unless the US also sends M1 Abrams tanks. German officials said this week a clear agreement on the transfer of German and US tanks to Ukraine has not yet been reached. However, it is clear that Ukraine needs these tanks in order to counterattack the Russian army in the spring. We'll have to wait and see if Germany's attitude changes in the coming days. A year ago, Russian President Vladimir Putin's forces brutally invaded Ukraine. Its invasion sparked the most violent conflict in Europe since World War II. Hundreds of thousands have died. Massive ethnic cleansing is underway and thousands of war crimes have been documented. Wars continue on a front of more than 600 miles. But Ukraine's revenge is imminent. Now, more than ever, Putin's heart seems at stake. Ukraine continued a defensive war from the beginning of the war until the autumn. During this time, the Russian army made advances in Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk. But the sudden decision of the Ukrainian army to attack in the autumn stunned the Russians. The successful offensives of the Ukrainian army, first to the south and then to the east, ensured that of the lands occupied by Russia, passed under the control of the Ukrainian army in a short time. Especially the southern offensive brought an unprecedented disgrace to the Russian army. Russia took the city center of only one of the 4 regions it occupied at the beginning of the war. That was the city of Kherson. But the successful attacks of the Ukrainian army overwhelmed the Russians, and soon the Russian army had withdrawn from Kherson. By withdrawing from Kherson, the Russian army presented the Crimea to the Ukrainian army on a kind of golden platter. Since then, the Ukrainian army has increased its attacks on Crimea. Several explosions have been reported in Crimea, where military bases are believed to be the intended targets. After the missiles hit, large clouds of smoke were seen in Sevastopol and Bakhchisarai, near Yalta. It was said the other day that a major drone attack on Crimea was averted. According to Russian officials, air defense systems shot down 6 drones, while electronic warfare systems disabled for the Ukrainian army's Southern Operational Command flatly denied that the Ukrainian UAVs were hit by the Russian air defense. Meanwhile, Mikhailo Podolyak, one of Vladimir Zelensky's chief advisors, denied that Ukraine used drones to attack Russian soil after Ukraine's official statements that it was targeting infrastructure deep inside Russia. Ukraine does not attack the territory of the Russian Federation. Ukraine is waging a defensive war to liberate all of its lands from occupation. The targeting of Russian infrastructure is the result of purely internal attacks. So is Ukraine hitting Russian elements outside its current borders. Ukraine's Western allies have discouraged Ukraine from attacking targets in Russia to prevent the conflict from escalating. And Podolyak's statement may reflect Kiev's attempt to maintain a degree of deniability in light of these Western concerns. In the past, Ukrainian authorities have avoided taking responsibility for the attacks in Russia, but they also insisted that Ukraine has the right to strike any target on Russian soil in response to Russian aggression. Ukraine stands behind the attacks on Crimea every time because they see Crimea not as a Russian territory, but is detached from Ukraine and belonging to Ukraine, according to Western allies and the United Nations. Crimea is not Russian territory. In 2014, the UN called for Russia to return to its internationally recognized borders. Despite this, Russia annexed Crimea, and after Moscow's broader invasion a year ago, President Vladimir Zelensky promised that Ukraine would retake Crimea. However, Zelensky said that one of the reasons why he wanted more powerful weapons from the US and NATO was Crimea. So what does Crimea mean to Putin? Home to the Black Sea Fleet during the Soviet and Russian imperial eras, Crimea could be Putin's king on the chessboard. The Russian leader may be determined to protect it at all costs, but Kiev may now fear any peace deal leaving the Russian Navy in port will threaten the coastline for years. After blasts shook the strategic areas in Crimea and Kiev, forces recaptured the nearby southern center of Kherson late last year. The door seemed open for an operation to retake the precious peninsula. However, Russian forces regrouped and excavated the area. The Kerch Bridge, which was blown up last fall as a strategic and symbolic blow to Putin, has now been fully restored, but will likely be targeted again if war comes to this peninsula. However, doubts remain about whether the United States and other allies are willing to give Ukraine the firepower it may need for such an ambitious operation, especially given the Kremlin's stance that Crimea represents the red line. The Crimean issue and the question of what will happen in the future is a topic for us to come. At least the demilitarization of Crimea is important for the future bilateral relations between the two countries. Sevastopol is full of Russian military elements. A UN committee recently accused Russia of extrajudicial killings, kidnappings, politically motivated prosecutions, discrimination, and violence in Crimea. It was stated that the target of many of these human rights violations is the Muslim ethnic minority. The Crimean Tatars, who have been oppressed for years and often oppose Russia's rule. Zelensky said that the war started here and will end here. This may mean that for the inhabitants of the peninsula and the rest of this war-torn region, the end of the bloodshed is far away. So why are Crimea and Sevastopol so important to Russia? Crimea was part of Russia from 1783 to 1954 when the Tsarist Empire annexed it, 10 years after defeating Ottoman forces at the Battle of Kozluka. The Soviet government transferred Crimea from the Russian Federation of Soviet Socialist Republics to Ukraine in 1954. It began appearing again in 1992 with transcriptions of declassified documents from former Soviet archives. In 1992, it included a section on the transfer of the Crimea, in which documents from the Russian Presidential Archive and several other archives whose collections are now in the State Archive of the Russian Federation. Unfortunately, these documents add nothing in content to what was published in the Soviet press 38 years ago. The documents confirm that the move was first approved by the presidency of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union on January 25, 1954, paving the way for the USSR presidency's authorization decision. However, the declassified files do not provide any further information on the reasons for the transfer, and suffice us with two official justifications published in 1954. The secession of Crimea was a noble act of the Russian people to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the reunification of Ukraine with Russia. The transfer of the region was a natural consequence of Crimea's regional proximity to Ukraine, the commonalities of their economy, and the close agricultural and cultural ties between the Crimean region and Ukraine. The idea that the transfer was justified solely by Crimea's cultural and economic affinities with Ukraine is also exaggerated. In the 1950s, the population of Crimea was about 1.1 million, roughly 75% ethnic Russians and 25% Ukrainians. A sizable Tatar population had lived in the Crimea for centuries until May 1944. On this date, they were deported en masse to the wastelands of Central Asia, where they were forced to live for over 40 years and were forbidden to return to their home country by the Stalinist regime. Stalin also forcibly deported the smaller Armenian, Bulgarian, and Greek populations from the Crimea, completing the ethnic cleansing of the peninsula. Therefore, in 1954, the Crimea was more Russian than it had been for centuries. While Crimea is briefly adjacent to southern Ukraine via the Isthmus of Perekop, Crimea's large eastern Kerch region is very close to Russia. The peninsula had significant economic and infrastructural ties with Ukraine, but cultural ties were generally much stronger with Russia than with Ukraine. And Crimea was the site of a major military base from the Tsarist era and became a symbol of Russian imperial military power. But this historical process does not change the fact that the Crimea is Ukrainian territory and Russia occupied these lands. The current war effort of the Ukrainian military is about completely freeing their country from Russian occupation. And as part of that purification, Crimea is one of the places that the Ukrainian military has cleared. It is not known what the coming days will show us, but it cannot be denied that the most intense conflicts of the Ukrainian war will take place in the Crimea in the near future. Ukrainians continued destroying Russian fuel storage facilities along all main supply lines leading to southern Ukraine. The goal of this campaign is to create massive shortages of critical resources, which will undermine the Russian ability to use the accumulated tanks and other heavy equipment to stop the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Over the last 4 days, Ukrainians conducted a lot of drone strikes, and some of them were very successful. First of all, Ukrainians successfully hit the Ilskoye refinery for the second time. Russian sources reported that the Ukrainians used at least 4 drones, and one of them reached the target and caused the fire by exploding on top of the reservoir. The fire rapidly grew, and the square area reached up to 400 meters squared. But this time, the firefighters also managed to prevent the fire from spreading so far. Ukrainians destroyed only 2 reservoirs, and as we can see, there is still a lot of targets in this region, which suggests that this is not the last attack on this refinery. Another fire also broke out in the Krasnodar region. The cause of the fire still remains unspecified, but the object is an oil storage facility. The square area of fire grew even bigger than on the oil refinery and reached up to 500 meters squared. This is the 4th oil-related facility that has been damaged or destroyed over the last week. And all of them are located on the southern supply line, which means that it could be used for the Black Sea Fleet or the Russian equipment in Zaporizhia. Today, Ukrainians conducted another strike on the oil depot in Sevastopol. As you remember, this was the first target. And even though in the aftermath of a huge fire, half of the refinery was destroyed, the freshest satellite footage indicates that there are still 12 reservoirs left that look like they could potentially be used. But the strike on Sevastopol was just a part of a much bigger strike on Crimea. The first group of drones were reportedly targeted Krasno-Perekopsk. This is one of the two most important logistical hubs in northern Crimea because all supplies that are being delivered to the Kherson region always pass through this small town. The second most important town here is Armyansk, which Ukrainians have been targeting in the past. Today, explosions were also recorded in Zhenko, which is located on the same supply line. And Russian head of Crimea also claimed that Ukrainians accompanied the drone strike with the launch of 2 ballistic missiles, Crimea-2, which were reportedly shot down above the settlements north of Odessa, which are also located on the same supply line. The second group of drones traditionally targeted the area around Yevpatoria. The goal of these strikes is twofold. First of all, Ukrainians are trying to prevent Russians from returning the aviation to the airfield in Novo-Fedorivka. And secondly, most of the Russian air defense is concentrated along the western shore. So continuous strikes are necessary for collecting intelligence about the most current disposition and capabilities of the Russian air defense. The third group of drones targeted Sevastopol and Hverdyansk. Even though this time Ukrainian drones did not reach the oil refinery in Sevastopol, something reportedly reached the Russian airfield in Hverdyansk. It was reported that at the moment of the explosion, the airfield had 10 fighter jets, 8 bombers, 6 air defense systems, and a lot of ammunition and fuel. So it was a perfect target. Speaking about the airfield several days ago, Ukrainians also conducted a successful drone attack on the airfield in Bryansk. As a result, Ukrainians completely destroyed one plane and 124 and damaged the fuselage of another Un-124 plane. These are very scarce and important planes that are capable of delivering 120 tons of cargo. Not only do they cost approximately $70 million, but Russians also only had 12 of them and are now down to 10. In the meantime, the panic around the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the Zaporizhia region reaches new heights. The Russian head of the region claimed that they're expecting Ukrainians to launch a large-scale attack any day now because weather conditions have improved and the ground has dried out. That is why Russians have launched the second stage of massive evacuation. If previously they evacuated people from settlements between Vasilivka and Tokmak, explaining that this is where most of the fights are expected to happen. Then now, evacuation was launched from all settlements between Anahodar and Poloi, clearly indicating a much greater scale of the expected battle. The massive evacuation brought disarray to the region, and some civilians reported finding thrown away military uniforms, claiming that soldiers were changing clothes and trying to take advantage of the disarray and desert by escaping together with the civilians because they did not want to be on the zero line when the counteroffensive is launched.